All right, hello and welcome. This is PaperStream 9.0 on February 16th, 2024. And today we're going to look over with some fun discussions within and after the paper, Atlas, a question-oriented approach to the use of pattern languages in knowledge management with the authors shown here. So I downloaded the PDF and we're gonna go through the PDF sections. The paper is there to look at specific quotes of, and because that's how it was in the snapshot that it is in an ongoing project. And so I'm really excited to have Ernie and Ernst and Tom, as well as Alexandra, one of the co-authors, maybe other people join, to explore this work. The text is there as written, so I won't just read the text. I'll just try to summarize what the section is doing there and maybe touch on any key point from that. Like what was the point what was the question that we asked there, or what was the question that we wanted to address there, which hint hint is also the kind of question and answer based system that together with pattern languages makes the basal layer of this Atlas approach, which is open source. So first page is just, it's a preprint. We have the title, the authors, and the abstracts. Well, any questions or thoughts like before we start, or like just does anyone want to just give any other context? Okay. All right, the Atlas summarizes some of the contributions to this paper. It's definitely going to be fun to, in live chat or with all of you here, explore some far out things and some work that's in the short or the medium or the long term. And this is more of a specification paper, and we'll talk about the history, like how it came to be, what it is, and what it could be used for. But just to be super clear, this represents a continuation and a development on a tradition of traditions by Scott David and his Atlas of Risk that was codified through work with RJ and I and others that we can use in some generalized context. But this is an open source specification paper. This isn't a how-to. It's not a situational analysis. It is nothing specific about any given system of interest. It's not anything other than an open source specification to get it out in 2023 to prepare for what we are already doing. So the introduction frames one of the core issues that underlies a lot of pain points and frictions and risks in what are understood as like physical as well as information risks, is about holistically considered the information supply chain, and not just the syntax, but also the semantics and all of the consequences here. In design and in biology, there's a recognition about this specialty generalization trade-off, and 14 standards and a 15th standard, and now there's 16 standards, and all of these kinds of pieces of knowledge, insight, and different relational relationships between different kinds of information, and all of these complexities and ontologies and all these different ways that there ends up being work that's all over the map, false positive, false negative, ambiguous, everything in between. And as was happening in 2023, as was happening in 1923, there are increases in the rate of publishing and generation syntactically of data. And with the advances that we are seeing just day by day, truth drops, this is becoming increasingly an issue with synthetic data, generative AI, and so on. But there's also incredible possibilities. So how can we approach this from a first principles fashion? Not with an exhaustive or an exclusive answer, but in looking to actual ways that we can triage in the short term work and look deeper time towards the kinds of specifications and systems that may also have properties that are going to be really beneficial in a few different areas. So Scott David, a very great fellow and awesome octopus is here, co-author. So Scott David, with background in law and working at the UW Applied Physics Lab, APL, he too much to say here, but to keep it short, he generated what was basically like an 1800 page PowerPoint presentation with these patterns, information patterns, as he was coming to understand them, whether they were risk factors or conditionalities or constraints or cognitive biases, all these different things that's maybe not every single one in every single situation was like you ought to know, but it was kind of like an encyclopedia, or like a dictionary where not every word is used in every single sentence and so on. And this was the atlas of risk. I copied and pasted manually all of those slides into another format, and that helped seed as part of ongoing discussions about the role of modular composable pattern languages for not just in the physical and interior and architectural spaces, but also in like generalized epistemic or cyber-physical spaces. Composable semantic pattern languages with natural questions, formal concepts of epistemic uncertainty and hypergraphs, like I hope Octopus and we can get into later. And so bringing together some of these technical and under the hood concepts like composability that are really exciting and elegant, with also just this is just how I'm seeing the story right now. Also, Scott's deep respect and compilation of different folkways and traditions, and not saying like these are the important things to consider in this kind of project, because we don't know if we're going to be making knowledge systems for some little sub-feature of an insect foot, and it's a nano ontology for that, or what it really is, or what kinds of semantics or interactions are happening with the knowledge format. And so given all of this, a sufficiently general layer to pull back to is the pattern languages, which is why pattern languages have been used and adopted in many different domains. But to be able to modernize and transfer the seedling of Scott's Atlas of Risk in his long and interesting careers into a generalized, essentially relational knowledge format specification, which is what Atlas is. Question-based and pattern language based, where questions can be of about 4 patterns. Each question's its own pattern. What's for dinner is its own pattern, but also you could assert different kinds of other patterns or descriptors, properties, processes, perspectives, and so on about a given pattern. And that could be a question, which is like more epistemically open-oriented. However, as we'll explore more, pre-specifies the semantic space quite vastly. Do you want X for dinner tonight can be answered with one bit of information because of the reduction of uncertainty in the targeting of the question. And there's like many more things we could say about that, but that's why the openness, so it's not just a qualitative spirit of curiosity and epistemic exploration, it's truly fundamental. These are the kinds of expressions and speech acts that people type into search engines, questions, as well as language models. And so there's a lot of ways to look at this, but the question-oriented system and having this fundamental basis for both pattern languages and questions as a fundamental epistemic mode, it's really amenable to all kinds of applications and ways that we can explore when we look at the patterns in the actual mock-up low-code CODA version, which is not the only version. It's a specification that could be done in a high-performance computing environment. This is just a low-code one because we wanted to learn by doing and show, not tell, as we even were templating. So 1,700 slides. Another inspiration is the common vulnerabilities and exploits database, and applying some of those understandings and approaches from software, open source software approaches, to more general cognitive systems. We built the low-code version in Coda. So even though it was very low featured, like there was even more that we could and more that we will and have done in Coda, like than the version that's shown here. Again, the format can be done on paper and pen and pencil, it can be done conversationally. It's just a way to organize questions and patterns about arbitrary subjects And it was really interesting and maybe kind of a side but important learning that some of the rate limiting steps in the participatory possibilities, which isn't the only way to do it. You can make a solo atlas, but some of the rate limiting steps and the frictions were actually not related to the technical, but rather related to like other kinds of things about like the legal or the intellectual property or the status of different contributions. In that early templating, we learned different insights. We gave more background on what we learned in these early stages. And then that takes us to, welcome, Marjay, the screenshots that are shown in the paper, which is also, we can look at the website itself here. And these screenshots just show some examples of what it looks like. It's not saying this is the best user interface. It's not saying it's the only interface. In fact, it is resolutely not saying that this is the interface because it's an underlying specification that will be visualized, already is visualized in multiple different ways. You can compose them according to a certain subtype that a given pattern is. So we can look at the visualization shown here. But suffice to say, speaking generally, you can make composable visualizations essentially programmatically because of the strong typing and the defined relations that are being used. There in the chat is the Atlas of Risk. Yes, actually, we'll get there. I think it's in the citations, but we did upload and archive Scott's Atlas of Risk as it was. Thank you, Sasha. We archived it as it was rather than try to continue versioning that. So that was this is not a exclusive knowledge format. And just to kind of give a proof by example here, the narrative campaign field guide, which like RJ and others had written, and this was collaborative work that here was semantically transferred largely, not entirely, but some of the core articulations into this defined knowledge specification format. So there was writing, but already, especially given day-to-day changes, it's easy to see how from large singular underlying federated and composable databases, it's possible to say, well, pull me everything that's a parent of this or that is one link away from this, and then just visualize them in a force-directed graph or in a graph where this is the left and this is the right and all these types of things. And so this is just like annotating notes, like, okay, they claimed that gene X was associated with phenotype Y. That's an assertion that a note taker can make in an assertion-based architecture that I assert that they asserted gene X is associated with Y. Who could disagree with that expression? And then that becomes linked up through multi-level knowledge networks, hypothetically, but this is not waiting for that to occur in its direct re-renderable utility for even one person working on a totally bespoke, non-project oriented, pure graph play. So this isn't saying this is like meant for a certain situation. It's a specification paper that makes some of the things that we're mentioning here specifically open source. So again, filtered views in Coda, of course, a higher performance computing environment or any kind of user interface could have arbitrary visualizations like accessibility, translations, localizations. Those are not things that are part of the essential specification, which is really question-oriented pattern language. Together, those things are conveying what is the interface agnostic process and data at rest structure that can then, for defined patterns and meta patterns and so on, we can come to instantly render little neighborhoods of the graph, like for a pattern that has been annotated in a way that it was dynamically asserted to be a vulnerability. So if the question was, what is a vulnerability that driving too fast induces? And someone says, there could be a sharp turn and this could happen. So then whatever they say to that, either it's an extant or it's a new pattern, added in, and it is given from via that assertion the dynamic typing of a vulnerability. Well, vulnerability is just a pattern. And then we can have questions and other patterns associated with vulnerability, like what remedies are associated with this vulnerability, or what kind of evaluative criteria would evaluate vulnerability. And then you can just continue in this aggregative way, many points to see where, okay, well, maybe just making a new pattern every single time is going to result in bloat of patterns, and maybe there's a cap, or use semantic clustering, or like there's many ways to work with this system, but we just cannot emphasize enough. We're not saying like this is the way to visualize this information. It's about pulling back to understanding and open sourcing a marriage point with the syntax and the semantics of epistemic curiosity, uncertainty, questions, and assertions, questions being a subtype of assertion, but assertions, more noun and adjective like, more verb like, whatever other frameworks that want to come together to project over this format, there can be a defined semantic type that we don't need to use assembly code as if it even existed for diverse intelligences to go into overconfidence bias. We take a different approach. We start with the index card, and then it's a cognitive phenomena. And then what do we ask and what do we know about cognitive phenomena in our knowledge environment, in our information environment? And let's do it in an aggregative way where either there's a Q kit, question kit for cognitive phenomena, or we'll make a kit, or we don't need one, or add one to the kit, and then that can propagate out to the other things that have been labeled as cognitive phenomena. So there's many, many, many dynamical assertions and structures that higher order usage of Atlas would enable that we haven't really seen in practice because of the low code level that we've been using it in, where only kind of first order moves are coming into play. But some of the exciting directions that people on this call's work could move towards is towards functionally open-ended composition of all kinds of complex queries that include genuinely semantic components that also aren't English laden, because patterns are not related to the connotation of one English sense versus another slight synonym, near synonym, all these different things. That doesn't say it solves translation or intra-language communication, but there's actually some structure around that that is part of what can be directly addressed infrastructurally and with practices and with all these different kinds of like individual and team specific tools that are open source in their specification and are not visualization bound at all. This is just a little screenshot of how we had unprocessed patterns, pulling from big lists of cognitive biases, so-called, and so on, and then just kind of deduplicating and munching them and adding them in, just to show that it kind of worked in spurts, copied and pasted, had some stasis where things were still developing and changing. We just weren't adding new, but just to show you can make arbitrary visualization. If you said, well, what about someone's commit history through time, or just like a Wikipedia page or a GitHub repo, you could understand contribution structures and all these other kinds of features of knowledge systems in this just first principles. Here's the data format of what the underlying structure is. It's not like a second order analytics on top of someone using another knowledge system. You could do that probably. Or you can just look at the first order basis, like how many lines of code was the code repo. This is just an example of automated rendering of some local neighborhood of a graph. Here's some restatements of the purpose of a system. Scoping, mentioning a lot of articulation points, like we're not talking about how you deal with reference IDs or all these kinds of things that are understood to be part of a more holistic actual knowledge management system. But here we're just focusing on this core motif with composability, pattern language through the questions with a dynamic assertion and these other kinds of features that speak to the purpose. This document is Creative Commons Attribution 4. Also, there's some additional disclaimers that we added given the status of the document and the fact that it's just an open source preprint in format, but read between the lines. Then that's 12 pages in. Again, anyone raise your hand, or like type in the chat if you want to ask a question. Otherwise, we'll look at the questions after we've kind of gone to the paper, just to be clear what's in the paper and then what's like not in the paper. To kind of speed up now, as we'll go through the details, which if you want to like dig into the specifics that are described here, again, pause it, take a screenshot, or look at the paper. The rest of the structure of the document is some of the theory, so not the pattern language history Scott David Folkways thread, but some of the theory foundations, then definitions of the system itself in terms of its specification and the mechanisms, and then last sections, the implications and future work, just to put some footnotes for possibilities. Here's some definitions that are used, maybe DDO, designer, developer, and or operator. DMCA, it's an example of a copyright law, and the other terms are API, application programming interface, so kind of an automated way to interact within and among a software. Some other terms. The diagrams are largely text-based, and the legend is here. Theoretical foundations. It's about patterns being the fundamental unit in this knowledge system. And then there's some other pieces that also are described, like the question epistemic openness and the dynamic assertion based upon the specificity of the question. There are other pieces to it, but this is why the first sentence is about pattern languages. And the second piece is the question-oriented design, which again speaks to the narrowing that the semantic frame opened by a question already speaks to in its framing. Not to say that it was the speaker's intent, but questions reduce uncertainty about certain dimensions, and also like the other co-authors on the team did a lot of cool work on questions very generally and different settings for questions. Where is it like a question but it's a command? Where is it a question but it's meant to elicit this other response? Like, and then when is it that but those are forms of information. And then one form of information where it's kind of just like a classic question, like what time is it? And I want to know the time. That would be like reducing uncertainty with what was given in response. 12 would mean 12 given context and prior. There's answers that don't make sense. There's answers that might mean something beyond simply the time, which is why having a fully assertional layer is so important. First, for the auditability, legibility, etc., of the system in practice, whether it's paper cards or whether it's high performance or Coda. And also because that's the actual granularity of the action, is the syntax of the assertion. But the actual multi kind of coarse graining of the semantics is very multifaceted. So to retain the most openness in the semantic frames that can be applied in a fully composable environment, ideally, then the assertion is the kind of syntactic unit that each of these like little pushes or little changes reflect. And then also another cool feature that kind of arises from this is missing information is information. Like if we have a phylogeny of 15,000 ant species and we have the genomes from these, and we know that this is how many ant species there are, then there's another layer beyond how many we don't know. But within this tree, we know what genomes are missing, or we know what level of information is missing. So it's not just that we're like adding notes and reading papers and just adding more aggregate information. There are certain settings where we know what we don't know, unknown unknowns. We can go into all these different things, but like we can also flexibly adapt schema dynamically. So certain kinds of on the fly and even early and mid stage reorganizations can occur, forks can occur merges and branches can occur, and large-scale repo type changes can also occur. Like by example here, it's useful to look at sumo, and the upper ontology of sumo, the lines of code have not changed in a long time after several moves. And then mid-level ontologies kind of grow within a pretty wide range. And then when it's large enough, it's like, okay, let's split that one into two. Or maybe it's okay that it's just a larger level, domain level ontology. And so this is a format where some people could be making a guild specific atlas for carpentry. Some other people would be doing it for another profession. Someone else is a hobbyist. And then the index cards could help coordinate communication. Just one type of use. And then also reflected with this third cell. So request for information contains information. Missing information is information. Disagreement over information is information. These two assertions and the known unknown assertion here by the non-speaker, these constitute the scenario. And so that is what we want to be able to understand certainties and uncertainties about, not like, is that animal a horse because it has 3 legs and horses have 4 legs, and this one's a little lightweight LLM and this one's a big LLM and this is an expert, but it's costly. I mean, there's just too many situations to even name, and they wouldn't make sense to name in this format or in this place because they are very dynamical in shifting compositions of different kinds of epistemic ecosystems. So to deal with that, rather than prioritize a certain kind of like fixed point to defend or a certain method of addressing disagreements, there's going to be different methods or multiple methods for resolving even trivially imaginable disagreements. Just like keep all the answers, or most recent one, or based on a trust network, or whatever, or endorsed by this person. A lot of different subsettings to go from a big data set into something that is usable and enjoyable and in part of a flow state for somebody who's interfacing with it, and so on and so on. But those are the kinds of views that can be taken already from just this great image that was made by Sasha. These sections define, we'll not go into each of them. They define the core pieces. So just we'll look at this full atlas representation. The next sections all go into more detail on reference ID. Again, a kind of topic that's not described in detail here. iQuery, which is like a question, but it has some slight differences. Then patterns entity, being able to be a question and or a pattern. And the attribute, the descriptor, and the way that they're linked. Entity, pattern, iQuery, prompt interface. I think this is cool. It'd be fun to hear what a few of you could say on this, but like the way that this is kind of designed, it could be a physical action that has to be taken to retrieve a piece of information, or it could be a transformation by a on-chain pre-registered function, or it could be a validated hash of a certain script, or all these different kinds of like science and like also leaving it open to even if it's digital, what has to happen. Attribute. This is a little bit of a broader view. So we just focused on the essential mechanisms of Atlas with the dynamically asserted patterns, compositional, ad hoc, structured, however you want to do it, with the question, interface, connected tissue, etc. But as alluded to earlier, in actual practice in 2023, some of the rate limiting steps were very much related to the legal container and quality assurance and, all these different, very pragmatic, very real, experienced limitations in the work. And this image gives a little bit of a more in-use systems view on how the verified information environment, or verified information exchange, and then the information exchange, kind of where information exchange can occur. A little bit of a bigger picture on how some of those kind of, if you're running it locally, like it's like your own Linux kernel and it's your own local data, it's your own text database. Okay, then it's very clear to see how, first off, this could be re-implemented just from this verbal description and the paper. But also that yes, there would be no limitation on what were composed in that local setting. No one can stop you from like deleting records and changing things and forging the date. But then once you start getting into sharing even an index card, let alone like a DOI corresponding to a paper, or like a YouTube ID corresponding to like a video, all these kinds of things, there's a lot more like, what is the quality of the data and who's responsible and contactable. And these are some very real things that do stymie efforts, because it isn't trivial. Like, what if we open up submissions and we have copyrighted material in this or that? We don't even know anything. So that was very real and very interesting. Yeah, RJ.
Yeah, I was going to say the splitting and merging of reference IDs is definitely like that. That is the most difficult part, and why why those structures were even addressed to begin with. You know, I think going back a little bit, you were talking about the index cards themselves, and noting that, okay, the name overconfidence bias isn't necessary. It's the name on the index card, but it's not the actual thing. It's like the pipe is not a pipe. The actual object is a reference ID, and you could disambiguate with a variety of different names. So you could easily re-render it based on whatever context you're in to say, well, I refer to it as this rather than that, right? But when you actually, in a technical setting, actually want to do that using Coda is pretty flexible, but even there, you have to get very hacky. And the moment you want to share between two systems, a lot of mess happens. Again, Coda is not built for that. So we had to kind of get hacky with it anyway. I just want to note, yeah, that split and merge, like, let alone quality assurance or legal container, which was its own problem. And I learned a lot on that as well, not realizing how much goes into that, where you want to pull community contributions and stuff, but where it's not within an organization. But that splitting and merging, and Octopus knows, we've been talking about this, is the consequences of splits and merges on the system. And if we want to view it as a graph structure, what the implications are when you split ref IDs and what that means for their attribute. So that's definitely next steps and future work for us, is that piece.
Thank you. So this is again kind of staying at this level of like, yes, Atlas is happening through that designer, developer, operator role or position in the context of a V, verified information environment exchange, etc. Here are some which we broke out. So above this point, even though verbally we've been talking about a few things, it's very clear about what the mechanisms are, and it's not a promise of how they'll have any implications. And then here is where we separated out, like, okay, what could happen with that motif in play? Like, if people could give the like button, then you could rank posts by the number of likes. But above was just describing the like button, but there isn't a like button. But a like could be a pattern. And then you could make the annotation assertion, I like that content. So that would just be one narrow possibility in these like categorical sheaths of like systems. And that's kind of a fun research and math question, is like looking at the affordances that do exist in knowledge systems. And then instead of wondering, so should people give a color that represents their feeling on that? Or should they type 2 words? Or should they pick a number between 1 and 10? It's like, find out, do multiple, make it custom. Why not? All these different kinds of things. Dynamic typing. This is like alluded to earlier, but the question leaves a mark, leaves a stigmergic mark. because it tags a response. Yes, the person could be doing performance art or like some second level strategy where it's like, what kind of car do you have? And someone's like, it's a horse. And then it's a joke. So it's never so simple as just accepting a first order claim. But if the person is giving an authentic and earnest answer to what kind of car is it, and then it's a new type of car that you've never heard of, but you may say, oh, it's a X. Why? Oh, I didn't know that make. And so there's like a way to understand questions about what kinds of cars that at the processual level could be like used by a used car lot in their inventory management and communication. Octopus?
I wanted to say, I think one thing this does really well is it guards against the tendency we have to flatten the uncertainty surrounding things as time goes on. So, like the fact that something is shocking to someone who sees it for the first time, we tend to forget that after we've seen it a multiple number of times. But for a pattern, that's really important to capture, right? So we're creating a pattern that keeps track of the fact that there is a level of uncertainty. And even after we know the answer, we still know that there was uncertainty somewhere in the process. And I feel like there's a lot of value in this, that aspect of this system. What do you
Yeah,
think?
thank you. And also a question could be, how many of product X are on the shelf right now? And then at noon, it was 5. And then there can be a distribution or uncertainty or heuristic or we prune shorter than 1 minute's not reliable, longer than 20 minutes we throw it out as well. Or here's distribution on a per product basis. That's just like how much modeling do you want to do? How much information do you have? How much synthetic data can you bring to bear? Like, but that's not something that should be limited in how we frame it as like a basic research and education question. RJ?
I was just thinking on what I was saying is uh, on the forgetting the initial surprise. It's like because you can store this data, you could store it like the whole atlas. Consider it like a file structure in this, just for argument's sake. It's like, well, you can save its changes across time. Like you have a version history. So if you think of like an atlas, it's just a way of structuring in GitHub, right? It's just like, well, you're going to have version history over time. So there is a moment before we have the pattern car and start to find it. So you can actually, like, given an ideal implementation, we'd be able to go back and see not only the moment that it was like, oh, this particular community decided it was worthwhile to start, one, naming the thing that this is a car, and then starting to develop the Q-kit, the questions that we ask whenever we see a car, what's the mileage, etc. But also the moment where, after a few exceptions got marked, the moment where they discovered, oh, there's a special type of car, it's an electric car, because we can't answer this question over and over and over again, and eventually it becomes worthwhile. But yeah, I wanted to note that. I think that's I didn't really realize the importance of that part until after we started doing some of the future work stuff of how we look at these structures in time series analysis. But yeah, I just want to agree. Yeah, I think
Nice comment. Yes. Maybe in the situation of interest, it's literally the dynamics, or maybe that's the only observation from a certain system, or that's what the V chooses to externalize is like their commit history or their, how much radio signal is being used, but not what signal, all these things. Information supply chain, because of this kind of blockchain transaction assertion level, cryptographically system specific encoding of every contribution to the knowledge system into the V, customs upon import into the Atlas V. Because of that, it could enable new levels or new types of auditability, interoperability, information supply chain integrity, and so on. Having some space between the finger and the moon, between the question and the pattern and the reference and the referent and the semiosis and all of these things may enable and locally does enable different kinds of interoperability, kind of used broadly like to mean differences in perspectives including mega ontological differences in perspectives, as well as stabilizing and versioning, giving visibility to like extant practices and folk ways, or how people are responding or what is happening. So it's not starting from a hypothetical alternative where people are doing anything different than what is already happening, but being able to do nothing other than assert and annotate the actual, being able to do nothing other than totally speculate. Like, here's the minerals on this fantasy planet. I'm just world building, but here's what we ask about minerals on that planet. And here's a new mineral I found. And then let's like start structuring that for fun. Navigability, all these kinds of features may enable just new ways to separate the archival map, the multi-stacked map, from the itinerary map, like the adjacent possible for a learner, or if someone's in more like explore versus exploit mode, or new ways to think about attention economies and all these kinds of topics. Returning to multiple perspectives and the information being in the plurality of perspectives, never to be collapsed for no reason. You could take a survey and then throw out the first 99 and then take the last one as 100% representative. You could reweight according to this. You could do that according to this prior. Like, those are not features of the survey data. There's many ways to analyze a survey. And so using the information that's retained in the assertions means that it becomes interesting when if 2 out of 3 say one thing and 1 out doesn't, and then the error profiles of different noisy experts have different correlation patterns, for example, that are much harder to fake. There's all these kinds of consequences from actually just taking a stance that can be taken in basically any data structure, but this is very, very proactively designed to include about disagreements as valuable for their error covariance and for just the actuality of what it records when there's disagreement. RJ? Oh, unmute, and then yes.
Just rehearsing. There we go. All right. So I think there's a link between this disagreement is valuable data and the restructuring and maintaining navigability section just above it that we didn't call out, but I think is important. And we've been I think this is something we've been learning over the last month or so, is that you can make a bad atlas. Like, it's you can do it like badly. There's no like perfect way or right way. But having like thrown together a few ad hoc structures now, I've realized there's like design patterns. So you can, like I tried doing one recently. It was atlas around coffee, and then ended up struggling with disambiguating coffee, the topic, from coffee as substance. And those are actually, it complicated things and just made me realize, it was like, oh, how you structure this from the beginning. And it could, with an ideal implementation, it would have been a little more easily fixed. But anyway, it's not going to like do the work for you. So there is like a process of designing and also allowing designs to emerge and throwing past attempts out. So now on the disagreement is valuable data part is that, well, we're not offering like, this is how, you measure the disagreement, right? It's like, if you have it may be as simple as, okay, well, we don't have a match between, like what do we call it, an octopus merge in Git, where you just take everything and throw it at each other and then see what matches and what doesn't, and where you end up with diffs and you resolve them as you go through. A diff count is a form of measuring disagreement, but with additional metadata, if both atlases are structured in a similar way, so those two information exchange environments are interacting and they have similar attributes or attributes that can be met through similar transforms, then all of a sudden, yeah, you can probably do some pretty crazy stuff, but it depends on how you build it. Anyway, I just wanted to note that like, because I think it's a weird spot. I didn't really know how much that would become the case, that you can, there would be design patterns for how to do it. So yeah, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, disagreement over very last mile details, like too noisy temperature sensors, but all the way on up to, is there a difference between the substance and the coffee materiality? And like, let's talk about and ask about that, learn about that. Sasha?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that. Since it is possible to design a bad atlas, what are some design principles that can be helpful when using this kind of data structure? Like, where could someone start for a topic?
Great. Let's just look at the future work, and then let's pick up right with like what we learned from this one, and then we can try to see more. But these are the next steps, basically. Some of them, and there's false positives and false negatives, and all kinds of fun on this list. But it ranges from improving our formal understanding with the category theory, hypergraph, generalized dynamical systems, and so on, and to connect at the formal level to cognitive modeling approaches. Then in the more sector-specific case, we'll learn a lot from really working through, develop a lot of the cognitive security components, which is to say, as we can now quote from some of the early CogSec 1900s definitions, the dynamics, the interior dynamics of the knowledge situation. But there's other great ones that we could talk about another time. But the scientist at the console in the semantic interpretation moment, if we can lock in and abstract over different kinds of encryptions and so on, then we can start to really look at these semantic and sense-making questions and all that goes along with that. Different collaborations with people who want to explore Atlas. We've seeded a few, and it could just be fun to play with any people who want to explore some of these things. More knowledge management research. And then I guess this is even broader. Understand some of the federated components better and this multi-atlas environment. So it's not just about the moves you can take within the Linux kernel, which is pretty much what this paper talks about analogously, but what happens when you have networking among Linux kernels? Totally different kind of question. Improving our depth of use of pattern languages, and at minimum, they can be used as kind of a very empty canvas to make arbitrary assertions. That's a great formal starting position. And then also, there's a reason like why Alexandra et al.'s books are so cherished, because everyone loves the breakfast nook and so on. So like making the pattern something that's real and transferable and not just like a kind of whimsical creation. But even that can have a huge value. So a knowledge system that doesn't enable that is missing on that possibility. Combine this with work on collaboration within and across organizations, and understand how like facilitators, team participants, different roles can play different roles in and out of Atlas information systems, and connect it with all of these other deeper basic research questions that we love, like cognitive modeling, active inference. So that is what that paper conveys. Let us go to any raised hands or questions. We can also look at this atlas, which is about CogSec, but atlases don't have to be about CogSec. It was just described by RJ about coffee. They could be mid-level. It could be supply chain management at the level of one restaurant. It could be just one hobbyist's questions about anything. We started with this kind of cognitive setting to understand different aspects that were in the cognitive science and cognitive security areas. So but we didn't prejudge what was or wasn't. We just slurped and munched and partitioned to make a proof of principle about that it could be ingested, and discussed rather than waited and anticipated but never realized because it was being held up in the hypothetical. But
And then-
in a given atlas, questions about what isn't of what status and what isn't, that is a question. But this was just like doing what we could with just trying to work fast and just learn the interface and mock things from there. Yeah, RJ, and then anyone else who raised their hand.
Yeah, I was gonna say on the post munching other knowledge basis on the topic and stuff. It was like it was slowing down once we hit that like exponential curve where we hit just technical scale problems. Because if you define a pattern in the QKit, it's like, well, for each object you're generating n new connections, that starts to stack very quickly. And for something like Coda, it just couldn't handle it anymore. So once it got to 1,000, it's like we had one good set of questions around vulnerabilities. It just kind of exploded, and it just wasn't going to scale well. So it is very much like ad hoc and was used to learn as we went.
Yeah, it's almost like this represented just with this one topic in our allocation of time. Like this was where we hit the quicksand, where it's like, okay, what can we do for remedy? It's like, well, what if it is a remedy or a de-risking in one situation but not another? It's like, how deep are we going to go into conditional logics where like speeding is dangerous here, but if you're being chased, it's not. And then like remedies, it's like, well, we could do a literature meta-analysis and we could like say what has been empirically associated with overconfidence, bias, amelioration, or assessment. But even that would be contextual, so we would need to pull back and be like, this paper, asserted in this experiment this level of evidence and do like a kind of review synthesis. And so that's very exciting that we could analyze scientific papers and look at, well, what is the effect of this on that? And then aggregate different answers just like they do in a meta-analysis with the reference IDs to the papers, extract the claims, perform the statistics just as one would in any other quantitative meta-analysis. So that could be the rigor that analysis or that V or sub V chooses to use on like, does eating this increase the blood levels of that? Whereas someone else, it's just like, if it's their own note-taking system, nothing's going to stop them from just saying this is associated with that, rightly or wrongly or literally whatever.
And ability to like mark assertions and stuff like that. It's like, yeah, well, is this a remedy is contextual. And the degree to which it's a remedy or is agreed upon that it is a remedy is contextual. And so this is part of the reason why the attribute structure in the specification ended up being as flexible as it is to account for that like, you could set a variety of sentiment indicators. You could even, have like embedded in an attribute a voting mechanism. It's pretty flexible. But I think the ultimate flexibility here though is that you could even have base atlas, which is just the index cards, and you could have an attribute that links to other atlases. So it could be an attribute that is literally linking to a particular context. So you have an atlas of atlases. You could have if you really wanted to account for complicated factors and context, like you could have an entirely separate atlas that's linked out and network it back in. So that, yeah, you want to look at social engineering within this context, that could be its own atlas. Like if you need to manage context that tightly, then you could do that.
And that's one reason why some of the formalization work with the graph theory, because, okay, we have social engineering and social systems engineering, and then like, these are very ad hoc, literally no different than just sorting index cards on a table at minimum. Or there could be fuzzy semantic search. There could be multiple overlays. There could be also known as, and all kinds of other under the hood. There could be like recognition of graph structures, such as loops or like dangling nodes. And then also we know what we don't know within the known space. So then If something is it only has one parent, we like to have everything get linked to 3 above and 3 below. Just filter for nodes that do and don't. Okay, Ernie, do you want to ask your question about language models?
This is good. So, Ernest and I have been having this debate for, I don't know, a year or two about AI. And, I'm very enamored of the ability for LLMs to digest vast quantities of data, even if it's a sort of amorphous, imperfect, intuitive way. Ernest is much more a stickler for rigor and precision, such as knowledge graphs and systems like this. And since you've been working on Atlas for a couple of years during the whole AI explosion, I'm curious what your thoughts are on how, explicit knowledge graphs versus LLMs, are they complementary, competing? Any idea how this is going to all play out?
Great question. A question that should be written down, added to a question kit about technologies, and deployed en masse, and versioned, and taken up, and used, and referenced in many locales. But we could give a better answer or a different one as well. RJ first, and then anyone else, and then I'll give a thought too.
Yeah, sure. So, recently it's been mostly, so I'm not an expert in AI, but with people that I work with who are closer into that domain, it's more like this is just a way to structure a RAG, which informs an LM. So an example came up recently is correcting information in a foundational model or just a very, very large language model is really hard. There's no silver bullet for doing that. You just have to provide more training data to correct it. It can be or you have to put wrappers around it. And again, right outside of my area of expertise. So take everything I say with a grain of salt here. My understanding is that there is no silver bullet for doing that without using some RAG approach. So where does Atlas interface or provide value for a potential interface? Is that imagine that you ask a well-structured question to the LLM about an object, and after you approve the answer, it updates the Atlas schema so that in the future that's now part of the RAG rather than something that's generated. Right? It's like the LLM is generating in ignorance, right? I think Octopus has brought this up before. Biggest problem with LLMs is getting them to say "I don't know" in response to a question. So having a really structured set of what it knows allows it to say "I don't know, but this is my guess," right? And if you like the answer, imagine that it would just immediately update that structured question, that iQuery in that structure, so that in the future, yep, it's responding with that answer. You don't have to create N wrappers over the system to moderate content in terms of, who's the director of this organization? It's like, if it changes, it's difficult to train and update. In this case, it wouldn't be. That's just my first take on it. But then I guess the second thing, and this is larger, is use of Atlas structures for training data. Like if we want to apply AI in more and more niche areas, we're going to need a lot of niche data. Niche data for niche agents. So if we're going to do that, we need to give it structure, and also, potential for data poisoning comes in and all that. So it's a way of managing quality. Again, really structured questions, that's not such a bad solution space for, crowdsourcing solutions and things like that. More easily checkable. But that's just, at a glance, what I'd say.
Yeah, these are great.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
As there will be few, relatively, labs and groups that are really innovating with whatever acronyms or large models are used. They're multimodal, etc. Context windows increasing, RAG, like RJ mentioned, retrieval, augmented generation, semantic search, all these terms, but basically the fluency providing models and the kind of CPU type operations that they perform are increasing in capacity. And so to have first principles like deep time and human interpretable stone as a unit, but the one is also that could be, light as a feather or stiff as a board as a unit, because it has similar expressivity and way, way, way more than our language. Because worst case scenario, you could pattern each word, ask for its definition, compose them into patterns called sentences and so on. And you could make third but not fourth order logic. So that's the big open research infinity diamond space. And then that brings up some questions like Tom and Ernie are raising in the chat that are about, like, I'll show Tom's question. But do you want to just ask the question, Tom?
Oh wait, before we move on, could I do one more note on quality control?
Yeah.
As I saw the Tom put in like managed quality, and I think there's a missing piece here worth bringing up. So there's a concept called intercoder reliability in managing like data which comes from humans. So human sourcing. And what ends up happening is the concept of intercoder reliability is that, well, when we see two different answers to, oh, what was the diagnosis, or which direction was the car facing at the accident, it's noise, it's a problem, and we solve for intercoder reliability. But as we move toward more and more subjective data, where it's not, what direction was the car facing at the accident, but was this a joke or a political statement on classifying a tweet, right? It's really, it's a world of difference between those two classifications, and there's no final answer. There never will be, right? There can't be in that space. So what's happening is we're starting to see people be like, okay, what do we do with intercoder reliability problems and training AI to deal with subjective spaces? So because there's no interest in developing some universal atlas, right? It's like, no, separate them out. If there's disagreement, split them. Totally fine. That makes sense. We want that because disagreement is valuable data, right? So what it may do, and this requires more work, like to figure out what the structure would look like and how you would source something, how you would combine them, again, merging and splitting and all that stuff has a lot of implications. But you could end up with a situation where you can now ingest like the same data set where you have like two perspectives or n perspectives, and that's the important part, is n perspectives on the same data set of tweets of, is this or is this that, right? Or on memes of what entities are referenced in the meme versus not. It solves some problems in intercoder reliability in a way that, as far as I could tell, wasn't really being addressed. And that's like data analysis generally. So I didn't really think to bring it up, the AI thing, but that's going to be like next stage. It's generating subjective content. Did it get this right or not is subjective. So being able to again, like combine data sets without having to do all of these like weird transformations is really interesting. It definitely, I think, needs more work though, communicating what's possible there and investigating what is.
Thank you. Tom? Wait, I don't hear you, Tom. But you're not muted.
Maybe stop sharing your screen so it's easier to see them for the rest of us.
I mean, you can change how your screen looks. I'll just read one question. Should a pattern library be able to give a pattern set of qualities and costs generically and for real instances of the pattern? So, yes. Like, let's just say we were making a horse atlas. And then that was there was a horse stewardship community, and so there's people who are wanting the lessons. There's different substyles, different agreements or disagreements about what were the substyles. And then one of the questions is like, what is the cost? And then you want to have questions about that cost, like which horse are we talking about? Who made the offer? Was it a bid or an ask? All these different things that actually are of a generic type, like offer. So yes, you could include the cost. And then by thinking it through in the idealized horse sale context, what kind of sale was it? An auction or a direct sale? Oh, there's a third kind of sale that just happened out there. Bring it into the schema. Okay, now there's a third cost. It's different than the way that we were asking about the auction, but these three questions are the same. Like the final transfer was paid in what currency? And then now there's this other question, like who was driving it from place to place? Because here they took it home and we didn't know that. But then we went back, we changed the schema. So yes, the object in the abstract interfaces with arbitrary, categorical, or quantitative, which we can definitely talk about, kinds of information. What is the cost? It could be too high. Well, that's what Daniel said that one day, that one time there. But that's not something that's anything other than what it was. Or somebody could say $1,800 and it wasn't true. So the space between never collapsing to an interpretation with no data points, you don't want to collapse down. With one data point, you don't want to collapse down. With two data points, you don't want to collapse down. With three or more data points, you don't want to collapse down. So it's like that distributional epistemic perspective and finding higher order information combinations. Yes. And then in the particular, if there was going to be like, okay, there's a guild of people that are trained up in Horse Atlas, and you get a $100 discount if they are certified and they oversee and notarize the horse sale. Because we found that horse sales that proceed with this certification present are de-risked in this empirical way. Because it was recognized by an observational study, and then a retroactive credential was provided, and that did lead to subsequent differentiation in information exchanges. A slightly allegorical tale, but yes, any attribute that we can think or say, there isn't a reason why it should be outside of the system, because this is more like abductive reasoning in that there isn't a closed number of entities. They can be proposed latent entities ad infinitum if you're proposing latent entities. Or you can say in this V, we only do this. Or we only accept Wikipedia edits when they're logged in this way. Or it's like all these different subsets. Like that's why it's fun to talk about this in the .0, because that's just the specification. And then how we really implement it with like kind of fun, like copy and pasting it into the chat interfaces, which I do commonly, or just using it like subliminally for myself, even to just be like, are we talking about a question? Or like, are they asking a question about what level of the type of what? How can I do a better answer by better understanding their perspective and their question in the honest knowledge encounter, and speak to that positive possibility in the well scaffolded, well semantically aligned frame-wise setting that makes disagreement even conceivable, because we don't talk about disagreement of like merely how things are physically in the world. Tom, have you ever seen a handbook of patterns with any quality and cost info about them? I have not. In the information space, no, but that's a great comment. In the interior design space, yes. Christopher Alexander's original pattern language book, even in the 70s, whenever they were doing these work, there's stuff like as a ratio of like more narrow room versus square room, here was the heating cost, or here's how much the material cost, because this material is this much per square foot. And so when the perimeter is like this, here's how the cost drops as a function of the pattern differential, narrow front yard, just making this one up, versus spherical, circular, or square front yard. But then someone goes, well, but my house isn't just a yard. Okay, what else is there to your house? I have a fence. How do you evaluate the fence? Well, it's 3 blocks in my community, and here's how. It's like there isn't a general answer. It's like there's not a price associated, even a range with like a car, but that's just in the dictionary as the index card is like what we're calling like just like the word in the dictionary. Car, you might pay, you might be paid. That even just depends on who's the buyer and the seller in the moment. But you might pay or be paid to take on a car, and it might be a toy car, or it might be a unique car. So understanding how you go from the sort of like ontology of where a car is, it's a type of transportation means, it's also, it's a collector's item. All of these plural assertions about what a car is. And then, oh, we're talking about this car, it's a collector's item. And then the questions then on with the actual work, not like we're going to do some other knowledge work and then we're going to need to come back here and, make it totally different. We just roll forward with making assertions and asking questions in the atlas. Right now, I'm kind of throwing them out into thin air, but for future extractions. But then what is extracted will only ever have been what was said in the moment. So still it'll be just so partial, but fun and unique. And then there'll be other ways to look at the data and imagine the content and what we're doing probably entirely. Yeah, examples in medicine, engineering, and others. I mean, like diagnostic codes are patterns. And then there could be subtypes of diagnostic codes. Or engineering codes could be what constraints is this room subject to? And then one of the things could be what county is it in? What state is it in? What country is it in? What hemisphere is it in? What season is it? It's just, and then, oh, we got surprised. That's the active inference kind of part from the world. Well, we didn't know that this was possible. And then just make the ontological update that makes that make sense. And then where people disagree or where it's an ontological bridge too far, there will be de facto differences in even higher order perspectives. But those people might agree on the lower level details of various things, like the actual temperature today, even if they have a different understanding of the world or something. Or there might be people who have a high alignment on some other aspect of their broader quantum reference frame, and then they disagree about the details. Any other like random thoughts or questions or anything from?
I was just gonna before going to I think it was Ernie's question that's next in there. But on like quality and cost, it's like in any pattern handbooks or field guides or books on pattern languages. I think like in software design patterns, you see like this is hey, these are the drawbacks. It just depends on how we define cost or what we want to look at. But yeah, if we're looking at like what is the cost right now, that's the snapshot. But I guess if it's in a more abstract sense, then it's like, yeah, many of them do, especially in architecture. It does make sense that there's like drawbacks to certain things and places where it should be used or shouldn't. But yeah.
One thing we were even talking about today was like data, like Shannon information data content. It's easy to talk about the video resolution or how many gigabytes of storage it takes syntactically. But semantic information could be transmitted in a way that's like almost in principle uncorrelated with syntactic data. Like there could be a low resolution PDF that gives you the information you need. There could be a very large PDF that doesn't have the information that you need. So again, from this kind of active inference and cognitive modeling perspective, we could say what we pay for or what we're interested in is how many semantic bits of uncertainty we reduce. So not pay per gigabyte like data uplink, which is the syntactic layer, but like focus on or pay for the semantic updating. And then what would that change or open up? And how would we talk about like semantic bandwidth? Like just again, going back to the syntax, it's like, well, there's situations where just being able to do 4G data is fine. You just want to listen to audio, be on a phone call. But then there's places where 5G is better, and then there's places you need fiber optic cable because it has to be this or that. So then with the semantics, it's like, where is it enough to be like, oh, Abraham Lincoln? Okay, got it. But it's like, oh, I was talking about another person. That wasn't just the coarse graining. It was another person than the one that maybe came to mind. Something like that. And how fine scale and what kinds of like semantic bandwidth to know that in the Lincoln family, when they talk, about their cousin, that's probably the context. And then being able to just start to even sketch and scout some of these epistemic modes that have many precedents, but few explicit ways to proceed, it feels sometimes. So like Atlas has felt like a way for us to proceed. For example, when RJ and I started in active inference, thank you, Sasha, bye. Atlas, just to see what it was like to just start one right off the ground, he just said, what's the first term you want in this list? I gave a term. He said, what's the definition of a term? I defined it. He said, are there any words in the definition that you'd like to define? We defined those. And then we were already in the game of like a personalized local understanding that doesn't need to make a pretense to be transferable beyond like two people having a very high quality information exchange. And that could have been done through letter. That doesn't have to be done through 8K video. Not that that would hurt, but that wasn't what happened with this progressive or incremental like co-information.
On that specific example, that was the reason I really wanted to do like a how to structure an atlas on using pen and paper, because that one was so simple. It was just instead of just writing a list of terms, just the index cards, it was very straightforward. It's what's the definition of this term? Are there any terms that are used that are necessary to understand the definition? And we know something about that, like by structuring that iQuery out, we know something about the answer. It too is a term, which means we're also going to ask the questions, because that's the Q-kit for a term, is what's the definition? What are the prerequisite terms that are necessary, right? And in just doing that, it's like generated a legitimate directed graph of prerequisites for understanding any particular term in that network, which is like, if you do it on paper, of course, it's like, it's hard to manage the exponential curve. That's it. Like, it's just higher interaction volume. That's the problem. It's like, if you do it on pen and paper, unless you very carefully define scope, which is why we want the digital implementation. But I don't know, just that one made me feel like it'd be good to do a pen and paper, a set of examples, just to show how.
Thank you. Ernest?
Yeah, you guys have been talking a lot about the definitions and disagreements as information and composability and all that. How do you decide what is correct and what is truth? Like, for example, in definitions of these words, where do you get it? Do you go to a dictionary? And then do you assign a level of confidence and authority to that thing? Or do you come with definitions just like, okay, Ernest says this is his definition, and RJ says, oh, this is his definition. How do you solve those disagreements?
Sorry, Dan, I love this question, because it's like, look, this is the point, is like, what's important is how you define the terms, right? For your atlas, right? Like, so let's take something as simple as definition of the term, an attribute, right, of an object. And the way that the atlas spec finds it out is that an attribute is an entity too. It inherits from entities. So it is its own object, just like the term that we're looking at, abstract, atlas, whatever, are entities. So is that attribute that says, oh, what's the definition of the term? That means we can attach metadata. It moves beyond like a JSON object, like a JavaScript notation object where, oh, it's flexible. It's like, okay, but the attributes are just namespaces. That's it. In the Atlas spec, what it is that the attribute is more than a namespace. It's an object, right? And that means we can attach things to it, which means that the way you would approach defining a term can be labeled in that attribute. So let's say we have two atlases. Daniel and I have ours for X and you have yours for Y. And we decide to share, right? We both have these attributes in our glossaries, right? These are simple glossary atlases, let's say. And so in both of ours, we have the term, we have the object, which is like an attribute, just definition of the term. But what this does is it allows us to very clearly see that we have different processes for it or the same. And that determines that merge function to say, oh, when we say definition of a term, we mean the same thing. Because we might not, because you might have standards or processes that we don't have for the definition, right? Like, so that's what I mean. Say it's in the context of understanding what an atlas is. It's less important to answer the question of how we would go about defining a term in our atlas. It's more important to look at what the fact that we can define and layer so much about our processes, our standards of quality control into that attribute, so that even though on our CSV files we both see, oh, definition is here, it's very clear that we might mean totally different things or exactly the same in order to, and maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe like somebody else is just ingesting our glossaries and it doesn't matter that we mean something different and they can transform it into the same thing in their atlas. The fact that we have different processes doesn't matter to them.
Let me try a complimentary response.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's a very Atlas pro user take. So different communities in a totally bottom up, legible, credible, defined way can say, it's like, here we believe there is an absolute truth, and this is the definition of truth. Another community or another little sub region, you could say, whatever the last touched version is, or you could say we retain all versions and we show a grayscale overlay, or here we use GPT 3.5 to summarize and then make a consensus statement. Here, whenever somebody pings for definition, we ring a bell and this person manually does this and then writes a haiku. So it's like there isn't a truth ontology baked into this, other than this to say that a cognitive entity can project their truth concept, rightly or wrongly or literally whatever, onto this semantic modularity. So you can have multiple definitions, and also arguing over definitions is only just one tiny flavor of epistemic ambiguity. It's a very visible one because it's like, what are the things that we care about? They are the definitions often of what we feel like things are. So it's a big topic, but it's just one other kind of place where missing data is information, differences of perspective are informative, and the work of real people might be to talk about those uncertainties and differences, certainly not for the specification to come swinging out of the gates with something like to curtail the freedom of that question.
So each item is like a namespace where it contains definitions according to whoever owns the atlas, right? And when you merge, if you decide to merge the atlas or to have a conversation between two people that have different atlases, so instead of talking about, oh, this is the truth, you will have a lot of information in that about that item for either one person or a group of people to decide what they are going with. Could be, is that what you say? Like, instead of having some ombudsman or librarian, um, the 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 participants decide what the truth is uh, by merging their own either believing what they see about that object or the history or whatever it has, and the people who that have contributed to that. It, I see that you will attach a lot of info into each item, and then either the reader or the readers decide what is the truth according to the, like you said, last touch or the, I don't know, maybe, some sort of whatever way of deciding what is the way that both of you would say, okay, yeah, this is the truth that we're going with because it's more recent, or the person is, if it's a medical thing, well, this person is a doctor, so whatever that person contributes is more valuable. Do you have that concept where the expertise of the owner kind of like, if he's a judge, then they will have knowledge of the law, things like that.
No, I
Mathematicians.
see. I see where you're saying. So one is just side note is like creating the system that helps qualify expertise. That is separate. Like that's so we're not making any governance decisions for a DDO for the operator or somebody who builds an interface for the spec or anything like that. We're not deciding anything like that because how people decide to define truth, that has to be left to any individual community or somebody's own knowledge base. So just for example, my example coffee atlas I made recently, like, look, it's not going to be a perfect match to the Q grading system for how to define notes in coffee. That is like the same way you would define notes in wine. Like, it's not going to match. It's like, yeah, because I just threw it together myself, and for me, didn't really matter. I'm like, look, I'm not trying to make the official guide on coffee. I'm trying to look into something myself and understand some patterns in differences of notes by origin. So it's up to me to decide whether or not a citrus note is actually a real note or not. I get to decide whether or not that's true because it's in my atlas. But if I want to interface with a community of baristas, right? Like, well, now we need governance decisions. Like if you and I, Ernest, like if we want to have an atlas together, like we're gonna have to have some governance process for deciding what's true. But for the spec, we don't decide that. Like at the level of the spec, we don't decide anything like that. Like in terms of how truth is going to be defined, we just developed the dynamic typing system underneath the data structure on which you could build a variety of governance structures. So like if you wanted to have a voting mechanism built into the atlas, not like a wrapper around it, but like built into it, you could do that. It's a state machine. Like you can build processes and things into it because it can hold all that information. And because of the way iQueries are structured, they can take action independent of us. So because we could layer in code, there's things we could do there. But like we don't have to. Like, and that's what I was saying about a paper, like a pen and paper atlas is a good place to start to understand that it's really more about this dynamic typing and the information contained within questions and how we structure information. And I think this is personally like my favorite thing about it is structuring information about the attributes themselves, which is that the attributes are objects. They're not just namespaces. They are like objects in their own right, as are patterns. A pattern in a traditional SQL structure, like a SQL database, is a table. It's like in our case, that's not it. It's like that ain't chief. Like it's not just a table, although we have to do that in Coda. We have to make it into a table. But they're objects in their own right that can be, have layered information and we can decide what it should contain.
Let me give it another answer to that. So yeah, great point. Yeah, arbitrary. You could do arbitrary governance. Information scheme. So here we're looking at the language concept glossary as edited in Competitive Engineering Book 2005 by Tom Glib here. So each of these are a concept. Here they're given this internal reference ID. But also each one of them could be like pushed to a GitHub address, or you could have a Zenodo or a DOI for each concept, or there could be multiple reference IDs. But they're just, for shortness, they're just given this prefix that's like easily searchable because it's not a normal character. But that's like a very plain text approach to weave a hyperlinking in a more fully executable environment. Maybe even one exists. Like you just kind of click a target is a requirement, you click on requirement. Like it could exist. Okay, what do we need to know about concepts? Well, what is the definition of the term? And then, how many kinds of term are there? And then now, how many kinds of term are there can be asked to every concept. Because we one time saw one sentence from Tom's experience says there's two kinds of target. And then, now we can pull back and go, how many kinds of each term are there? And then for one term, there's just one kind. Another, the answer might be many. Another, it might be there's exactly 4 terms. And then, how is target specified? With parameters. Which parameters? What is a goal? How many kinds of goal are there? What is a budget? How many kinds of budget are there? So as we just walk these totally adjacent curiosities that are written and unwritten, we develop a web of assertions and increasingly strong and resilient typing schemes. Like after, taking a few big whacks at what a goal is, maybe the neighborhood has been explored. And so we have kind of a stable typing of what a goal is. And then there could be various kinds of connective tissue and language models that take in a certain region, make a summary, make a translation. What is the Spanish concept 48 word? What is the blank word? Because of course, this is what is amazing about separating the English word from the concept referent system. It's not a language specific thing. So it's like, now, like, we kind of can't unsee it because it's like, well, what is a target? What is a target not? Oh, well, now again, we pull back to every concept. What is not a blank? And then that's an opportunity for incredible, unique human input. And then if it's just like, okay, speed up through this part, like we get target. Or maybe experts enjoy asking, like, this may be the most distilled version of someone's experience with what they did and didn't put. And so if we use just a statistical language model, it's going to vectorize, et cetera, turn into a vector database, put numbers onto this. It's going to transform these words, into a vector space. And then it's going to give us, depending on the temperature variable, a blur. So it might just continue to write paragraphs that are just kind of like about systems engineering, why it's good, what's the downside. But we've not gotten any closer to touching anything strong. It's just more and more similar sounding in terms of the vector region, similar sounding text sampled from around that region. You could write a PhD dissertation around this region. And autonomous agents can do that even today. But what would really transfer and translate, because what if we translate it, we know just from playing around, you go from English to Spanish to English to Spanish, and like you get stuck in these weird loops and all these, like, you get all over the place. So we can't do like a soft, high reliability translation, but it's super easy. So that might be quick and dirty. But what would be formal would be term by term, actually tokenizing the semantic concept. That's the term. That's why there's a glossary. That's why this is mega high information density. Because these are what we actually want to preserve in terms of the assertions and the claims. And then someone else could look at this just like a GitHub code and just say, It's a strategic and tactical framework. And then someone else can say, no, or whatever. It just, we can't even know until you get the ball rolling with actually putting this into thought and into deed. Then it starts getting really fun. And I think that's a good place in case anyone has any last comments. But otherwise, this is a fun .0.
One note on that particular definition you were looking at on I think it was underneath target, it was in the notes. But there is a description of cases where larger firms produce optimal components but suboptimal whole systems. That's like, there is a name for that pattern that I've seen elsewhere. I do not remember what it is called. But cases where any structure produces like optimal solution at the local, and even though you have a collection of optimal solutions in local environments, in the macro, it's not behaving optimally. And there is, I know there is a, maybe esoteric, but there is a phrase for that pattern. I don't remember what it's called, but the idea is, in the future, I could call that out now and be like, disambiguate it and say, this is this, placeholder, and down the road, find it, name it, and then say, yeah, anyway. It's like, without having to change the text.
And boring stuff, like we culturally diverged. We used a different symbol here.
Yeah.
So then the question about this glossary, do they use a key finding concept plaintext, and then being able to do search, but find only where it's in front of a certain pattern of numerals, not where it's used like in a different setting. If we can say it and think it, we can follow our own tracks and continue to stretch and bulge our ontology, at least messily and kind of shabbily, if not way more epically, and also to bring in a real enacted spirit of pluralism. Like, this probably is not being claimed. I mean, Tom is not able to speak, but like, nod yes or no. Is this intended to be the final only definition of target? Okay. But then why did you write it? No, I'm just kidding. Thank you all for this fun stream. So we'll continue the discussions. Good luck. Thank you all for watching. Hope everybody enjoyed it. Bye.
Thanks for hosting. It's good meeting both of you.
Yeah, thank you. Good talk.
Mm-hmm.